Everyone knows Frankenstein, but did you know an 18-year-old girl created it? Her name was Mary Shelley. The year was 1860. Storms trapped a small group of writers inside a villa overlooking Lake Geneva. To pass the time, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. What Mary Shelley came up with wouldn't just win the challenge, it would become one of the most influential stories ever written. But to understand how Frankenstein came to exist, you first have to understand the remarkable woman who wrote it and the devastating life she had lived. Mary Shelley was born in London 1797, into one of the most remarkable families in England. Her father, William Godwin, was a celebrated political philosopher. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had become famous for arguing that women deserved the same education and opportunities as men, which made her liked in some corners but extremely disliked in others. But the day Mary entered the world was also the day tragedy entered it. Just 11 days after she was born, her mother died from complications following childbirth. Mary would never know the woman whose name she carried. 4 years later, her father, finding himself totally unfitted to educate them, married his next door neighbor. Mary would never really get along with her. She would later write in her diary, "I detest Mrs. G. She plagues my father out of his life." Despite everything, Mary really adored her father. His home was a gathering place for some of the greatest writers and thinkers in Britain. Philosophers, poets, scientists and political reformers regularly passed through the front door, filling the house with conversation about literature, politics and the future of society. Mary would often listen in from the sidelines. Long before she became a writer herself, she was growing up surrounded by some of the brightest minds of her generation. But home wasn't always a happy place. The tension with her stepmother only deepened as the years passed, and in 1812, when Mary was 14, her father sent her to stay with friends in Scotland, near Dundee. For the first time in years, she felt free. She spent months wandering the coastline, reading endlessly and allowing her imagination to roam. The landscape of Scotland would stay with her for the rest of her life, later finding their way into the lonely mountains and wild scenery of Frankenstein. When Mary returned home in 1814, everything changed. Among the regular visitors to her father's house was a young romantic poet named Percy Shelley. Shelley idolized her father's political philosophy and would frequently visit to seek his advice. He often arrived with his wife, Harriet, but it wasn't her father who captured Percy's attention. It was Mary. Before long, the two had fallen deeply in love. Just months later, despite her father's furious objections, they ran away together, traveling across France, Switzerland, Germany and Holland, with Mary's stepsister Claire Clement. Their journey was filled with adventure, but reality would soon catch up with them. Money became a problem, friends and family turned against them because of their relationship, and by the time they returned to England, Mary was pregnant. All while Percy was still married. In February of 1815, she gave birth to a baby girl, but just 12 days later, the infant died. Mary was devastated, writing in her journal, "Dreamt that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived." It is difficult not to hear an eerie echo of Frankenstein in those words. A lifeless body restored to life. Over the next year, life remained turbulent. Mary gave birth again, now to a healthy son named William, while Percy struggled with mounting debt and the fallout from his failing marriage. Yet despite the chaos surrounding them, Mary's passion for reading and writing never faded. Then in the summer of 1816, they got an invitation to spend the season at Switzerland. She, Percy and Claire traveled to Lake Geneva, where they spent their days with Lord Byron and his physician, John Polidori, but the weather refused to cooperate. To entertain themselves, they read German ghost stories, debated science, and discussed whether electricity might one day be capable of restoring life to the dead. Eventually, Byron proposed a challenge. Each of them would write the most terrifying ghost story they could imagine. Byron began a story about a vampire, which Polidori would later develop and publish. Only Mary and Claire couldn't think of anything. Inspiration didn't come easily from Mary. "I thought and pondered, vainly, and felt a blank incapability of invention, which is the greatest mystery of authorship, when dull nothing replies to our anxious invocations. Have you thought of a story?" I was asked each morning. But on one night, Mary awoke from what she described as a waking dream, knowing she had found her story. "I saw with shut eyes, but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life." Over the following months, she poured herself into expanding that idea into a full novel. But life outside remained just as turbulent. In December of 1816, after the tragic suicide of Percy's wife Harriet, Mary and Percy finally married. Just months later, in September December 1817, Mary gave birth to another daughter, Clara. By then she had finished writing her novel. Frankenstein was finally published in 1818. With no name on the title page, many readers assumed it had been written by Percy Shelley. Few could believe that the novel's creator was a 20-year-old woman, but Mary had only just begun. Just weeks after the book was published, she and Percy left England for Italy, hoping to escape debt and beginning a new chapter together. But again, tragedy seemed to follow them wherever they went. In 1818, their young daughter Clara died before reaching her first birthday. Less than a year later, their 3-year-old son William died from malaria. 3 of her children were gone. The losses left Mary devastated. Friends would describe her as withdrawn, carrying grief that never fully disappeared. Yet even through unimaginable heartbreak, she continued to write. Then in November 1819, she gave birth to another son, Percy Florence Shelley. Finally, life started to feel good again. But happiness never seemed to last. In the summer of 1822, Mary suffered another devastating miscarriage that nearly claimed her own life. While struggling to recover, cracks began to appear in her marriage, and Percy grew increasingly distant. Just weeks later, he set sail across the Gulf of Spezzia and never returned. He was just 29 years old. 10 days later, his body washed ashore. He was cremated on the beach in a ceremony attended by close friends. According to a long-standing legend, Mary kept his heart. Well, it probably wasn't his heart since he got cremated, but apparently at the time Mary believed it was his, and kept it for the rest of her life. Despite everything she had lost, she kept on writing. Over the following years, she published several more novels, including Valperga, Lodore, Faulkner, and The Last Man, a haunting story about humanity's destruction by a devastating plague, now considered as one of her greatest works. She also edited Percy's poems, wrote countless essays and stories, and supported herself almost entirely through her writing, something few women at her time were able to do. Although Frankenstein slowly gained readers, Mary never lived to see it become the cultural icon it is today. She died in 1851, at the age of 53, likely from a brain tumor. When her desk was opened after her death, her family discovered a small collection of keepsakes she had carefully preserved throughout her life. Among them were locks of her children's hair, Percy's notebook, and the silk wrapping containing what was believed to be his heart. Mary Shelley's greatest creation wasn't just a monster assembled from dead bodies. It was a story born from loss, from questions about life and death, and from a young woman who had experienced more tragedy before the age of 25 than many people would in a lifetime. More than 2 centuries later, Frankenstein is still alive. Not because of it being a simple horror story, but because Mary Shelley filled it with the fears, grief, and hope that shaped her own extraordinary life.